Yeah.
Oh, man.
Okay, so I am here to talk about municipal affordable housing trusts. Statute passed in Massachusetts quite a few years ago. I am happy to have you interrupt me as I'm going along. I can try to pay attention to raise hands, and Leah maybe can help me as well, but I'm more than happy for you just to jump in if I'm going too fast or if you have a clarifying question. But we will have time, we should have time at the end as well to have a conversation. So just quickly, MHP, Mass Housing Partnership, we're a quasi-state agency. We work across the state, and we're really focused on increasing the supply of affordable housing across the state. So we do that in a variety of ways. I'm with the community assistance team. So we really focus on working in municipalities as well as with housing authorities and nonprofit organizations, offering technical assistance and really supporting you to be supporting affordable housing in your community. We have a lending team. We've lent over $1 billion to support over 22,000 units, new creation as well as preservation. We really focus on affordable rental housing. We have the One Mortgage, a home ownership team that has the One Mortgage program that's for first-time home buyers, a 30-year fixed interest rate product, and it really is the most affordable mortgage product in the state for households earning up to 100% of the area median income. And then our newest team is the Center for Housing Data. So we have a team of people that are collecting, analyzing, and sharing data to help inform policy, housing policy on the local, regional, and the state levels. So my team is, as I said, we really focus on the municipal level, and with nonprofits and housing authorities, we do a whole bunch of different trainings throughout the year on different topics. And sometimes we also do regional focused kind of trainings. We offer technical assistance. So we work with municipalities. If you have municipal land that you're interested in seeing developed perhaps into affordable housing, we can help with some of the pre-development work and writing the request for proposals. And then my work really focuses on, a lot of my work on communities that have an affordable housing trust or would like to create one. And so helping to support you to do that. So tonight I'm going to go a little bit over about what a municipal affordable housing trust is. So look at the statute a bit, and then get into some of the operations and best practices that we've learned from just working in a lot of communities across the state and just observing how different trusts are functioning. And then I'm going to get a little bit into the eligible activities, the kinds of things that an affordable housing trust could be engaged in your community. So to start off, the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust is organized under Chapter 44, Section 55C. It is a public entity and it's created by your local legislative body with a majority vote. The purpose is to create and preserve affordable housing. So it's really about affordable housing. It's not about market rate or even mixed income. It's really about affordable housing. And it's led by a local board of trustees that's appointed locally. The bottom left, it might be a little bit hard to read, but because it is a municipal entity, it's not outside of the community. It's a municipal board. It's subject to public procurement, designer selection, conflict of interest, public meeting laws, just like your planning board, like all of your other boards. So a brief overview of the process to establish a trust. The first is for the community to decide whether you want to just pass the statute as it's written, which some communities do, or whether you want to write a bylaw and add some additional guidance to the structure of your trust. And then it is passed by your legislative body, a majority vote. Then the bylaw would be submitted to the AG's office in 30 days. You would then be able to establish your board of trustees. Many trusts at this point will record a declaration of trust to establish the powers of the trust. So the registry will take this as a standalone document. It doesn't need to be tied to property if you go through the registry. And then the trust can have a trust fund account set up. This is generally through your municipal treasurer. And then the navy blue steps are our recommendations that I'm going to get into a little bit tonight later on in the presentation. Very broadly, what a housing trust can do. So your affordable housing trust can really be focusing on the affordable housing needs in your community and supporting local control of housing initiatives. The trust can engage in real estate activity. So the trust can buy and sell property if it desires to do that. And the trust can make timely decisions because unlike your community preservation committee, where the decisions of funding decisions need to go to town meeting, the trust actually doesn't need to wait for town meeting. The trust can move more nimbly in the real estate market, assuming that it has funds in its account. And the trust as a municipal entity can be collecting funds from a variety of sources that I'll get into as well tonight. So that's just really general, the kinds of things that the trust can support you with. So the statute requires a minimum of 5 trustees, and the only specification of who those trustees are is that in a community with a select board with a chief executive board, one member of the select board needs to be on the trust. The statute doesn't have any other directives of who sits on the trust. It's up to the community. And there is no maximum of how many people can be on the trust. So the minimum is 5, and many communities have just 5 trustees. I think that in my experience, I would guess that 7 is probably most common. We have some communities that have 9 members, a couple that I know of that have over 10. I think that's it's most typical to have 5 or 7, but it's a community's decision. Some communities want certain boards to be represented on the trust as well. So they may list that in their bylaws, they write their bylaw. Some communities may give some direction of the kinds of expertise they'd like to see on the trust board. So they might list certain kinds of backgrounds, legal backgrounds, affordable housing, real estate law. We would just suggest that if your community moves forward and you decide to do something similar like that, that you not be too prescriptive, that you leave it a bit open, because one, you don't want to lose the opportunity of a great candidate that just doesn't fit into certain categories, but also over the long term, you don't want to make it difficult to fill the spots on the board as well. The board members are appointed by the select board, and the statute does specify 2-year terms, and many communities stagger those terms like we oftentimes do with nonprofits and other boards. And they're listed as public agents, so special municipal employees, just like with your other boards. I think most of your other boards. And then the statute lists a variety of different powers that are given to the trust. We do have communities that may, well, the statute allows you to add to the powers as long as they're in keeping with the statute. And the flip side of that is we do have some communities that may put some parameters on the powers. So some communities may want for example, a 2/3 vote if the trust is looking at purchasing property, or they might want some decisions, perhaps if they're going to spend over a certain amount, to be subject to oversight by the Board of Selectmen or the Select Board. We would caution about being too restrictive, because you don't want to move away from some of the key benefits of having a municipal affordable housing trust, which is being able to work really nimbly in the real estate market, not missing opportunities. But some communities do decide to put some restrictions just based on kind of the culture and the environment in the community. So I'm going to go through just 2 brief case studies of different communities that have an affordable housing trust. So Brewster, a community on the Cape, they created their trust in 2018. They actually had an existing affordable housing fund that was not very flexible. So they dissolved that, transferred the funds to the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust. Wrapup, where they have 7 trustees. So they have a select board representative, which is required by the statute. They give their town administrator a position on the trust or an appointee. And at this point, the town administrator has appointed the assistant town administrator. So that means the municipal staff person is on their trust. They require a representative from their affordable housing partnership and a representative from their community preservation committee, a representative from their planning board, and then they have 2 citizens at large. So this is how they've decided to structure theirs. They actually have probably more representatives of boards than we might suggest, just because, as you know, oftentimes anyone who sits on one board sits on 2 or even 3 boards, and you just want to make sure that people aren't overcommitted. I've been to a lot of trust meetings where they have a hard time getting a quorum because people just, those that are appointed to the trust just have a hard time committing the time. But in Brewster, they really felt like for communication within the town that it was important to have this representation. And I think also having a municipal staff person has been beneficial with communication. The town administrator and assistant town administrator, they pretty much know everyone in leadership. And I think it's really helped them with their communication. And then you see that they did decide to put one restriction on powers, that allocations over $50,000 are subject to the select board's approval. And then going back to the top, the second bullet, they created their trust. And then in the first year, they took a little bit of time to do some planning. So instead of trying to just jump in, they developed a mission statement. So they really spent time to establish what the role of the trust will be in the community. They then developed some goals with priority initiatives. And they also had 1 or 2 housing forums to engage the community, to allow for conversation and feedback. So they really did some good work, some groundwork to create a strong foundation as they move forward. The second community I wanted to look at is the city of Beverly. So of course, a much larger community. They created their Municipal Affordable Housing Trust in early 2017. And so their trustees, they have 5 members, the minimum required by the statute. Their mayor, as the chief executive, sits on the trust and is actively engaged. Their director of planning and community development is on the trust. Their director of municipal finance is on the trust, and then 2 at-large residents. So this is the only community that I know of where a majority of the trustees are municipal staff. That's very unusual, but it's what they decided worked for them. In most communities, the trustees are volunteers, they're residents in most cases, and then some allow someone who doesn't live outside in the community to be on the trust. And then some, like Brewster and here, they have municipal staff. So with Beverly, they have 1 restriction on powers. So the conveyance of real property requires not only the mayor, but also the city council. So it allows the city council to be engaged in that power. And then their funding at this point has primarily been in lieu of payments through their inclusionary zoning ordinance. And they do have the Community Preservation Act, which could be future income, but I don't believe that they've received CPA funds yet. And then back to the bullets. So their first year, they appointed their members. They completed a housing plan. So Beverly has over 10% on the subsidized housing inventory, but they wanted their trust to be able to start with updated information about what the housing needs were in the community, so that it wasn't based on old data or assumptions of what was happening, but they really wanted to have updated information. And then after the plan was completed, they spent time really reviewing the plan, understanding it, and then they developed housing trust guidelines. So the guidelines that were going to direct what the trust invested in as a reflection of the needs that were identified in their housing plan. And then they developed a NOFA, a Notice of Funds Available, that was released at the end of 2017, notifying developers how much money they had available that they were going to distribute. They received applications, and then in 2018, they actually distributed their first funds. So similar to Brewster, they took some time to really do some groundwork to identify the role of the trust, how the trust is going to operate. And part of that work was engaging a couple of affordable developers. They invited a couple of developers to come to one of their meetings and to go through a pro forma, a housing development pro forma. So they invited Habitat for Humanity that presented a very small scale pro forma to teach the trust how they structure their deals, how they use different funding sources. And then a nonprofit developer that does a little bit bigger developments, they brought in their one-stop application to a project that it's the application that's actually submitted to the state, so that the trust could see the complexity of an affordable housing development, a little bit larger affordable housing development, and how many different funding sources it takes. And that really helped the trustees develop their guidelines and determine how they were going to distribute funds to support the creation of affordable housing. So I just wanted to ask if there are any questions at this point before I move into some of the operation best practices. If anyone just wants to jump in if you have a question.
I was just thinking the 2/3 rule that would, if you had 7 members on the trust, that would require 5 of 7 voting in favor. So
The trust only needs a majority vote.
okay, but you can decide, for example, to purchase property that you need a 2/3 majority. You said something about that earlier on.
So it's just that some communities with some of the powers, they might want a higher bar for some votes.
Gotcha. Okay.
I've known of a community that they want 2/3 if the trust wants to borrow funds. So there is a if you wanted to add a higher bar with certain kinds of decisions, that's possible, but it's not required in the statute. And a lot of communities do not require that at all.
Thank you.
I just wanted to be upfront that some communities, for different reasons, decide to limit the powers in one way or another.
Gotcha.
Okay, so as we're working in more communities, it's not really rocket science. The things that help a trust be successful is that they have money that they can work with. They have a vision, a sense of what their role is in the community, leadership that can help move things forward, and then transparency within the community, openness with what they're doing. So the big one is the money and where are trusts getting funds. And the good news, I think, is that we're seeing communities be much more creative and thoughtful about bringing in a variety of resources. So at this point, we have about 120 affordable housing trusts in Massachusetts. And most of those are municipal affordable housing trusts. Some of them were created before the enabling legislation. So Boston, Cambridge, they've had trusts for many years. Out of the 120 housing trusts, about almost 80% of them, maybe 76, 78%, also have the Community Preservation Act. So having CPA has definitely been the impetus for a lot of communities to create an affordable housing trust, to have an entity that's focused just on housing. So CPA is a common resource, but by no means an assumption in some communities. So the yellow hexagon, inclusionary zoning. So several communities do have an in lieu of payment that's allowed. And so a community like Swampscott their trust has received funds through their inclusionary zoning in lieu of option. The blue hexagon, cell phone tower lease payments. There's a community on the Cape where they have a cell phone tower and the lease payments are directed to their affordable housing trust. The green hexagon on the bottom, we have some communities that have transferred free cash. So Brookline and Truro are examples of communities that transfer free cash to their trust. The top hexagon, the green one, the special bylaw or ordinance payments, there might be a special bylaw that could direct funds towards the trust. Tax title sales, income from tax title sales could go to the trust. We have our first community that had a municipal bond that passed a municipal bond. So Medfield created an affordable housing trust maybe 4 years ago now, and they also bonded $1 million to seed their affordable housing trust. They don't have CPA, so it was bonded against their municipal funds. Tax override Orleans is the first community that I know of that has passed a tax override to fund their trust. So they created the trust a few years ago, and then an override, a $275,000 tax override was on the ballot that summer and it passed. So Orleans is the only community that I know of because they do have this consistent income. They actually have a line of credit at a bank because they have these funds, these guaranteed funds that they can count on. There might be developer negotiated fees. You of course need to be careful how you do this, but there have been cases where a developer has contributed funds and the community has designated those for the Affordable Housing Trust. Some communities, particularly higher wealth communities, are considering donations as a possibility, and that could be cash. It could also be property. It could be a site, a lot, a building. Short-term rental fees, communities are talking about this. I think Gloucester might be the only one that I know of where they're using some of the fees from short-term rentals to go towards affordable housing. And then you likely know about legislation for the real estate transfer fees. More and more communities like Boston, Nantucket are wanting to be able to have transfer fees that go towards housing. Some communities are talking about tax from marijuana sales that could potentially go towards affordable housing. We're just seeing a lot of different funding sources that communities are trying to tap to support affordable housing creation in their community. So as we work in more and more communities, there are some things that we're seeing and that we're suggesting to new affordable housing trusts. So one is to start with your housing needs. So if you don't have a current housing needs analysis or a housing production plan, so I think that when I was talking with Leah earlier in the week, that it's a few years is a few years old at this point, your housing production plan. So that's, within the 5-year window. So that may be enough to get started, but we always suggest that the trusts start with current data of what's happening in the community, and that the trust members take time to really read that material and understand what it's saying about the identified needs in the community, and then to take some time to set some priorities, like Brewster and Beverly both did. The housing needs in all of our communities are really significant, and this is a volunteer board. It will always have limited resources in comparison to the need. So take some time to set priorities. What is the trust really going to focus on in the initial years? And the trust could create some benchmarks if there was a particular need that you really wanted to address. Somerville community, where their trust has set that they want to spend a certain percentage of their funds on households earning below 50% of the area median income. So it was a benchmark that they created for themselves and that they put out there, so that not only do they remind themselves about that, but then they're sending a message to the community and to potential applicants that their trust really wants to address the housing needs of the lowest income households in the community, not just at 80% of the area median income. You don't have to do that. It's something that you could do. And then we suggest that the trust create a mission statement. So a sentence or two just to help focus the trust, but also to tell the community how the trust sees its role in the community. So I just pulled these off of websites. On the left is Grafton's, and I appreciate that Grafton put in their mission that they're also going to be educating and advocating for affordable housing in the community. And then Amherst on the right, one thing that I like about Amherst is that they are reminding the community that it's an instrument of town government, that it's not outside of the community, it's a part of the community and helping to implement the town's identified affordable housing goals. And then we suggest that the trust take some time to do some sort of planning. So many trusts like Brewster and Beverly do an in-house process of guidelines or goals. Some trusts, like on the right, Amherst hired a consultant and did a whole 5-year strategic plan. So a lot of what a community decides to do is reflective of like local capacity, how much planning you've already done, how recent your planning, past planning has been. So it's just a decision, a community decision. There's no right way, but we would suggest that the trust do some kind of groundwork instead of trying to jump in, because what we've seen in the past when communities would just create a trust, appoint trustees, and then try to jump in, that they typically end up spinning their wheels because the needs are so great and they haven't done kind of this work of what are they going to focus on initially. And then it really takes teamwork, that it takes trustees, capable trustees who can give the time. It really needs to be a working board, not just showing up, but people who will take pieces and to really be engaged in the work. It takes a chairperson that can do some project management, that can help move things forward. And then the most successful trusts that we've seen have some kind of paid support, whether that's administrative support, so helping with the agendas and minutes and communication between different boards, whether that's technical, whether it's hiring someone to help with different kind of, whether it's searching for land that may be feasible for affordable housing, whether it's someone to manage a program, rent assistance or some kind of program for the trust. But most trusts that are the most effective have some kind of paid staff. And this can be done by some communities have a part-time housing coordinator that helps to support the trust. Some communities have an administrative person that supports the Community Preservation Committee and the Affordable Housing Trust. Chelsea has had that model. Some communities might have a part-time staff person already in the community, and they're able and willing to take on additional hours to support the trust. So there are a variety of different models about how that can be done, but in most towns, the existing planning and community development staff oftentimes just don't have the capacity. So it generally is about adding some capacity somehow. In some of our cities that just have more capacity in their community development departments, just because they're bigger and they have more resources, there might be some in-house capacity. We see that less in towns. So it's something important to keep in mind and to give some consideration to before establishing an affordable housing trust. We also suggest that the community consider clarifying roles between different boards that might have a role in some housing strategies. So this is just taken from Manchester's housing production plan. It's an exercise that they did where they established their housing strategies on the left-hand side. They determined shorter term, 1 to 2 years versus a little bit longer, 3 to 5 years. And on the far right, they put their lead board or boards for that particular strategy. So not only does it help create some accountability for the lead boards, but it also helps to keep the boards from stepping on each other's toes because it's giving a lead for those different strategies. In some communities, it could include housing authority as well. There could be in some communities an affordable housing committee or an affordable housing partnership. There could be other entities that could be involved in this, but it's something to consider when you're starting up, just because when we add a new board to our community, it can create some tensions if there are other entities that are already doing some kind of overlapping work. And then we always encourage affordable housing trusts to be transparent in the community, particularly when we're working on affordable housing, which we all know can be very controversial. It's really important that the trust not make it difficult for people to understand who's on the trust, who's supporting the trust in terms of staff. What is the mission of the trust? I suggest putting financial statements about resources as well, although I don't know that very many do that. Put the bylaw, use the web page to put this information and to put a link to the bylaw. If you have any programs or anything that you're investing in, like put it on this page. Don't make it difficult for people to understand what the trust is doing. Report back regularly to whatever boards you identify as important and key for communication. When the trust invests in different developments or programs like rent assistance, promote those, make it clear to the community that those are the things that you're investing in. And then some communities, their trust just wants to have money in their account and they want to review applications and decide whether they want to fund it. So they want to act a lot like a CPC, a Community Preservation Committee. Others are wanting to initiate efforts and help to fill voids in the community. So during this pandemic, it was actually in many communities, the Affordable Housing Trust that initiated emergency rent assistance. We're also seeing more trusts engaged in disposing of municipal land for affordable housing. So we see more trusts that are involved in the pre-development work, in writing a request for proposals, reviewing applications. In most cases, the municipal land is not transferred to the trust, but we do have some communities where the town transferred surplus land to the trust, and then the trust completely managed the disposition process. And then some trusts really want to be involved in advocacy in the community, like Medfield's trust is very active in promoting the affordable housing developments that they think are good for the community. So we encourage the trust to have a conversation initially to determine how your trust is going to operate in the community, and then to be clear about that, to be explicit about that in town. And then as we're engaging in supporting more affordable housing and addressing our affordable housing needs, there oftentimes is some tension. So there is oftentimes a lot of support for the concept of affordable housing, but when we start talking more specifically around where developments might go, where they might be, there can be a lot more tension. So there are different materials that the trust and other people who are wanting to support diversifying your housing options in West Newbury that you could use to help you with your conversation. And this is just one. This you could even just Google, you don't have to live here, and this PDF comes up. And it was a partnership between Enterprise and a social anthropologist that tested different housing messages to see why so many backfire. And what they found were these sorts of things, that we need to be balancing people with place and systems, that to not just focus on people and people that need affordable housing, but also the places and the systems that make it difficult for people to access housing they can afford. Telling the story of us, not just them, not just singling people out, because people who need affordable housing are us, they're a part of our community. Connecting housing to other social issues and outcomes. So we know that health outcomes improve and educational outcomes improve when people have access to safe and affordable housing. We know that where you live affects your life outcomes and affects children's outcomes. And then the language, our language can impact how people hear us. So they tested home versus housing, and they found that the word housing that people oftentimes associate it with public housing. And while we are strong advocates of public housing, it's very crucial. A lot of people have really negative connotations about public housing. Whereas, or they've heard housing as a commodity, whereas home, they heard that as the place where they find themselves and their families. In the development world, we oftentimes talk about housing projects, and that that can trigger a lot of people because it sounds like the projects, and people have ideas of, you know, enormous developments in the inner city that are violent. And so I when I'm in communities, I try to use housing development, but taking some time to think about how are you going to talk about the need for diverse housing options for affordable housing in your community, I think can be helpful. It can help the trustees to be thoughtful in how they communicate what they're working towards. So the last section I want to get into is to go into some of the eligible activities, the kinds of things that the Affordable Housing Trust can be investing in. And again, feel free to interrupt me if you have questions or want have anything to clarify. So a few years ago, the Housing Trust statute was modified to better reflect the Community Preservation Act as well, because we had a lot of communities where the CPC was wanting to transfer funds of the trust. But the trust statute really focused on just creating and preserving affordable housing and didn't have the language specifically around support. So there were communities that were wanting to do support activities, but it technically wasn't in the trust statute. So now the trust statute allows all of the uses that are allowed under community housing with CPA to be allowable for an affordable housing trust. So that's why I use the verbs of CPA, acquire, create, preserve, and support, because the statutes are now very closely aligned. So one example of acquiring is this development in Barnstable that it was a larger development, 124 units. And it had been, I think it was permitted under Chapter 40B, so only a percentage of the units had been affordable. And then in 2011, a nonprofit developer was able to access some CPA funds. So all the examples that I'm giving are developments that could be funded either through the CPC and or the community, your affordable housing trust as well. This one specifically was funded through the CPC, but a nonprofit developer was able to access $500,000 of local funds to then buy this entire development. And now almost all of the units are affordable. A few are market rate because some of the households were not income qualified and they didn't want to displace anyone. But it's an example of being able to use local funds to acquire existing housing to be made into affordable housing. We have.
Wait, can I interrupt?
Sure.
They bought that place, $500,000 they bought?
No, I'm sorry. They used the local funds to leverage additional financing to buy the whole development.
And that additional financing was was
Many
it
millions
grant?
of
Was
dollars.
it other stuff? Excuse me?
Yeah, so it was likely tax credit funds through the state and probably a mix of a variety of different sources.
Okay,
So
good,
the local funds were used to leverage state and federal funds.
good. Right.
So yeah, sorry that would have been really cheap. An incredible deal. So we have many affordable housing trusts that have some kind of small scale home ownership program. They sometimes are referred to as buy down programs, and they look different across the state. So there are many different ways to structure these. This is just one community, one program in Leverett in Western Mass. And clearly their housing market is going to be different than most of the communities in Greater Boston, or all of the communities in Greater Boston. But the way that Leverett has structured their program is that the max purchase price is $275,000, that they will offer up to 20% of the sale price, or $50,000. Actually, that might be a little bit higher now because their purchase price increased a bit. The way that they do it is they'll have a amount of funds that are available. Like say they have $100,000, and then they'll create 2 vouchers, and they'll do a lottery to see who's interested in buying in Leverett and qualified to buy. And then if you win the voucher, then you have a certain amount of time to find a home and to purchase the home. And then the trust puts in these funds to help at the time of that purchase. So they have their Regional Housing and Redevelopment Authority manages the program, but it's a way to help a small number, because they generally don't have more than a couple a year, but to allow home ownership of existing housing, so existing single family housing, or it could potentially be a condo, but I don't think that Leverett has condos. So it's one way to structure these kind of programs. None of the programs that I know of add more than 2, maybe 3 houses a year, because they're expensive. The subsidy generally per unit is high. In Leverett, it's not as high, but in Sudbury and some of the communities in Greater Boston, it's easily $175,000, $200,000 to buy down 1 unit of housing. But it can be a way to help preserve some of the naturally more affordable housing in town, because it's some of the smaller kind of Cape style houses. As well as spreading out some homeownership opportunities in the community.
When that happens, when you get a home like that under $275,000, they get the grant, they get a chunk of money. How do you keep that house affordable in the future? Are there any restrictions on how much they can add to the house, or resale value and returning money to the fund or anything?
Yep, great. So Leverett, their program is affordable for households earning up to 100% of the area median income. So they're using CPA funds, and that allows the funds to go up to 100% of the area median income. Because that doesn't qualify for the subsidized housing inventory, so the state's not involved in these. So Leverett has their own restriction on these units. And so at the time of resale, it does allow some appreciation, but it needs to remain affordable for a household earning up to 100% of the area median income. So it's modified. So the Regional Housing and Redevelopment Authority helps with the monitoring of these developments and the resale, so that they'll remain affordable. In other communities where they want the units to be counted on the subsidized housing inventory, the state's universal deed rider is added to the units, which means that they need to remain affordable for households earning up to 80% of the area at median income. And then they work closely with the state, with DHCD, to make sure that the units are added to the subsidized housing inventory.
Thank you.
What? So we have a lot of examples of affordable housing trusts investing in the creation of new affordable housing. So this is just one example in Yarmouth of this site that along Route 28, you may know that Route 28 has many of these motor lodges, old motor lodges, and slowly there's redevelopment happening in Cape communities. So in Yarmouth, they actually redeveloped this portion of Route 28 to allow for multifamily housing. A private developer acquired the site and then worked with the community to develop these 29 affordable apartments that are 1, 2, and 3 bedroom. They're affordable. 62 units are affordable at 60% of the area at median income, and then 7 at 30% of the area at median income. When you see these kind of numbers of the 60% ceiling, you know that affordable housing, low-income housing tax credits are part of the deal because that's the ceiling for the low-income housing tax credits. And the state does require that some of the units are deeply affordable at 30% AMI. And then the community, their housing trust put in over $2 million, which came out to $30,000 per unit. So a significant investment. This development actually was funded in the first round of seeking state funding, which is fairly unique and likely because of the rezoning of the area to allow multifamily as well as the significant local investment. This is a much smaller development in a much smaller community in Western Mass, Goshen. They had a committee of people that were actually looking at the housing needs of seniors in town. And the committee felt that some affordable housing that was age restricted was a need within the town. They started working with trying to find a site, and a church in their downtown had some surplus land. They also reached out to a local nonprofit developer to see if there was some interest in potentially developing. The nonprofit was able to acquire an acquisition loan from CDAC, which is another quasi-state agency that helps nonprofits acquire sites for affordable housing. Goshen had passed the Community Preservation Act, so they had some local funds at this point. And this proposal for 10 units was created, 10 rental units of single floor, 1-bedroom units. And then the local community ended up putting in $130,000 of funds. The nonprofit developed them. And so 10 units for a community as small as Goshen. I'm forgetting what the population is offhand, but it's a very small community. 10 units is a very, it's a very decent sized project for that small of a community. It's a community that doesn't have a lot of money, but they did have a little. And so it just shows that even our smallest communities are working to try to find a project that can work for that community and investing some local funds to support it. We have many examples in Massachusetts of reusing existing buildings for affordable housing. Sometimes there may be a historic component. The shoe shop place in Middleborough, that was a shoe factory. I don't know if it actually has any historic restriction. It might. So they might have a historic component, not always. Stevens Corner in North Andover was an underutilized nursing home that was acquired by a nonprofit organization and now is 42 units of family housing or non-age restricted housing. The community put in about $1 million to support that development. Going back to Middleborough, the shoe shop place, that's now 25 units of rental housing. That's again, not age restricted. But in this development, the community was a new CPA community, did not have very many resources, and they contributed $30,000 of CPA funds. That still allowed the nonprofit developers, there was two nonprofit developers that partnered in this. It still allowed them to take that local contribution to the state to show local support. And it still was able to receive low-income housing tax credits and the other resources that it needed to make this development happen. And then on the far right in Swampscott, this is a school that has been redeveloped into age-restricted apartments, so senior apartments. It's actually 55 plus, so I'm not sure we'd call that senior anymore, but age-restricted. So just 3 examples of buildings being reused for affordable housing. In many cases, this is a development that's less controversial than new construction because it's bringing an underutilized building back online. So it could be a strategy for your community if you have buildings like this. And then with Preserve, what we generally are looking at with CPA funds in the CPA world with Preserve is, and therefore for the trust, is preserving the affordability of units. So with many financing tools, the affordability restriction may only be 15 years or 20 years or 30 years. So that was the case with this development, Rolling Green in Amherst. It was a large development with 41 units that were affordable, but they were only restricted for 15 years. So as it was coming up on the end of those 15 years, the community was concerned about losing these 41 units. The developer, the owner, was not interested in extending the affordability. He wanted to make them market rate, and in a market like Amherst, it's lucrative to have market rate units. The community really wanted to preserve them, so they reached out to MHP. We started talking with them about strategies to extend the affordability. They reached out to Beacon, another developer that has extensive experience in multifamily developments in affordable housing. Beacon ended up negotiating to purchase the development from the developer, and the CPC, the town, bonded $1.25 million of CPA funds to help preserve the affordability of these units. The 41 units are now affordable in perpetuity. So the bonding is something that most trusts would not be able to do because they just don't have a consistent source of funds. So it would have to be through the CPA. But many trusts are keeping an eye on expiring affordability of units and helping to be engaged in negotiating, extending that affordability. Under the support category, the kinds of things that we've seen as fundable as pre-development. So if there's a municipal site that you're interested in potentially seeing affordable housing on, doing some of the initial work to determine the feasibility for affordable housing could be funded through the trust. Updating housing needs could be, the trust could put some resources into that. And then rent assistance is something that is many communities have used their funds in their affordable housing trust to support. To kind of wrap up, some key kind of wrap up tips is, as you're thinking about establishing an affordable housing trust, we really suggest that you consider your local infrastructure. So the resources that you already have in the community, the needs, and to really be thoughtful about how a trust will, what the trust will focus on, what the niche of the trust will be, to make sure that there isn't duplicating anything, but that the trust has a clear mandate, that you really direct the trust to be developing goals that reflect identified needs, that really reflect what has been identified in your housing production plan, and that given that it's a board of volunteers, that it be realistic about its capacity, that instead of trying to do everything sloppy, that the trust really focus on doing a few things well based on the capacity in town. We have a variety of different online resources that are available to your community. And I, as well as my team at MHP, you should see us as resources as well. We want to support your work moving forward. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and to allow for questions or conversation if you have any comments or questions.
I got one that should be a quick one. We have some affordable housing units in town, and they need to stay affordable. So if somebody moves out, that means a lottery process, et cetera. And then of course there's, there can be maintenance issues and all the administration associated with it. Do affordable housing trusts deal with that sort of administrative work?
So because the trust is made up of volunteers, and oftentimes the trustees are not experts in managing affordable housing, we never suggest that a trust either be the developer or even hold the units because of the complexity of managing it well, particularly if you want the units to be on the subsidized housing inventory.
So do the trusts, for example, take a look at experts, services, and then agree to hire a service to do that work?
Yeah, so in many cases, to be helping to help monitor the existing units, then the municipality would hire someone that has the expertise to do that. Yes. And not have the trust do that. It really should be an entity, a consultant that has the expertise.
And are those consultants typically funded through trusts, or are they independently funded through some other mechanism in the town?
So it could be through the trust. It depends on how that particular municipality has set it up. So some communities are involved in regional housing service offices, where the community has a contract with an office, a regional office that provides some services like monitoring. And then those funds may come directly from the town and not through a trust. In other communities, if it's not an existing structure in the town, if it's not set up already, it might be initiated through the trust. It's different for different communities. In some, the housing authority might provide those services for the community. So it's different depending on the community.
Thank you.
I noticed
Yeah, I
there
have a
was one.
question.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, Shelley, thank you. Excellent presentation. Very, very helpful. I'm a member of the planning board in town. What's the two questions? What's the typical time frame to get a bylaw in place? Say if you were using a model bylaw, and I'll let you answer that first, and I'll come back with one more.
So I hate to just say it depends on the community, but it really does. So like some communities, they queue things up quickly and it moves through fast, and others need a little bit more time to have a longer conversation in the town, to kind of go around to different boards to bring them on board. So some communities it can take longer. I think that if your community is already talking about establishing a trust, you've already done some of the groundwork, that some communities then will put together. If you decide you want to write a bylaw where you want to have additional guidance about who, for example, who should be appointed to the trust, some communities will put together kind of a subcommittee of people that help to write that and then present to the select board. So maybe that takes a few months to do. And then maybe there's also kind of some outreach and communication happening in the community. I think a community like Westboro, they just established a trust that went through town meeting last year. And they started in January of that year of having kind of a public forum around affordable housing. And then they put together a subcommittee that really kind of researched a trust and helped to put together a bylaw and make some recommendations. And then it went to town meeting in the fall. So that to me was a really thoughtful process that they had a lot of kind of steps that they did in the way. But then other communities, they decide, and then in 3 months, it's going through the process with town meeting.
Okay.
In communities, there's more resistance, and it can take a few years for them to kind of keep bringing it up to educate the community and talk about it a little bit more.
And one other question. I think I heard that not every project that a affordable housing trust does needs to produce subsidized housing inventory. You can also do something creative locally, like for, I guess the Goshen thing is very interesting to me. Just pick for an elderly population, and the town could set the parameters, but they might not qualify for the subsidized housing listing.
Yes, Ocean One actually does qualify for.
Oh, it does.
That one does. Mm-hmm. It's set at 80% of the area median income, so it is on the subsidized housing inventory. But low and moderate income is actually not defined in the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust statute. So we do suggest that communities define that for yourself, and that you look at existing definitions of low and moderate income. So if you want everything that the trust invests in to be on the subsidized housing inventory, then your ceiling would be 80% of the area median income.
Right.
CPA allows 100% of the area median income. So that's how CPA defines moderate income is up to 100%. So that could be how you define low and moderate income for the trust. The state's Affordable Housing Trust defines moderate income at up to 110% of the area median income. So that's one thing that the trust should also do initially, is to define low and moderate income. And that means that not everything has to be on the subsidized housing inventory if you don't want to limit yourself to 80%.
Okay, thank you.
Because it's public funds, there needs to be a public benefit, which would mean there needs to be some sort of restriction on the units, but it doesn't need to be the state's restriction.
We did have one question from Ann O'Sullivan that was posted, and it's a good one. Could you address the difference between the Affordable Housing Trust and a community land trust?
So community land trust, and I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form, but they generally own the land. And with a trust, the trust generally wouldn't, I mean, sometimes communities want there to be a lease with public land with the developer. But the Affordable Housing Trust wouldn't own the land and manage it in the way that a community land trust does. So the Affordable Housing Trust, it's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So it really is a funding source to help support affordable housing, but not generally to hold it or to hold the land.
Got it. Thank you.
Kind of model.
Why don't we open it up to questions from other members of the public? So, Leah, what do you suggest is the best way to do this? Folks, just speak up. Oh, you're muted.
If someone would like to speak, I'd suggest you unmute yourself and you know, chime in. You can also type into the chat. I believe there's also a button you can press to raise your hand if you don't feel comfortable speaking.
And Leah has the slides in PDF that it can post. I think she's going to post this video as well for other people too. So even if you don't have questions right now, we are forever available. And my information, my email is on the last slide that Leah can send out to folks. Feel free to email with any questions. I'm happy to do follow-up if you come up with questions tomorrow or next week or as you're moving forward.
Thank you, Shelley. Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions is, Leah, I think, would we make this available through the planning board website? Would that be the easiest? Because I know there's been interest in that.
Right. I actually need to work out with the town manager's office how it will be posted. It will be posted early next week.
Awesome. Great, thank you. So are there other questions from other members of the public? Go ahead, Ann.
Thank you. I understand that there's an option for the select board in order to expedite this process, or at least get this process going before a town meeting vote, to set up an affordable housing partnership. Shelley, are you familiar with that? And how does that work in terms of just getting this ball moving?
So a lot of communities have an affordable housing partnership or an affordable housing committee. And with some of them, they have a specific role in the community. So the partnership may review affordable housing proposals in the community, like Chapter 40B developments or inclusionary zoning developments, like that might be part of their role. And they might have an advocacy role, they might have an education role. So some communities already have that kind of infrastructure that can help with the process of then establishing a trust as well. If you don't already have it, I think that you just need to think about, do you start with a committee or a partnership that wouldn't be a fund, where it wouldn't be distributing resources the same way that a trust was? Do you start with that first and then consider a trust down the road? I think doing them at the same time could be very difficult. Of just you want to make sure that you have people that can fill the spots on these new boards, and you want to have clear different roles for the different boards. So I just think that it's a local conversation of what are your key needs right now, and what would be the different roles, the different boards, and how do you want to start? I'm sorry, I know it's really vague, but a lot of communities already have one of these entities. And so it's oftentimes the conversation around creating a trust actually comes out of one of those boards. And it usually also is something that's identified in a housing production plan or needs analysis as a strategy to create a trust. So if you don't already have one of those boards, I don't know if you would want to start with that.
Okay.
or not.
Okay, that's good advice because I don't, the last thing people want in this town is to volunteer for a committee that has no authority and has no power. And then they do a lot of work and doesn't really result in anything. But if this partnership can sort of set the groundwork for the Affordable Housing Trust and just get going and take the pressure off some of our current boards and committees, that was my thought. We could just get a jump start on this.
So I think if you're not interested in creating a trust until maybe next year or in 2 years, like it's a future kind of thing, then it might make sense to have a committee. Another thing could be to, like Westboro, they established, I can't remember exactly what they called it, but it was like an Affordable Housing Trust subcommittee, or it was the committee that really helped to research the trust, talk about it locally, educate people about it. So it was like an ad hoc, short-term kind of committee. So that was really smart, and that makes a lot of sense. Instead of establishing another board that you'll need to staff, or that you'll need to have people on indefinitely. But there are communities like Wellfleet's pretty small. They have a housing authority, they have a housing partnership, and they have a trust. But the work that we've been helping them with recently this summer has been to help delineate the roles of each board, because there ends up just being overlap and a little bit of confusion. And so we're trying to more clearly establish each role. But I kind of like the ad hoc idea that might be appropriate for your community.
Yeah, I think just getting a group of people, just getting the ball moving, and then helping what I hope will be a fall town meeting decision to adopt an affordable housing trust. We're already boots on the ground, so to speak, and we've already got some research done so that this trust can actually get going right away.
Mhm. It could help support the startup of the trust as well. It could go beyond the town meeting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks.
If the town already owns land that has been identified as for municipal use, that we would like, that we think is appropriate for the development of affordable housing, how would that play into our ability to dictate, for example, from developers, what we might like something to look like, or what we might want the prices to be, or would that be a benefit to us to be able to say to a developer, here's that we already own and that we'll give you at a discounted price or whatever? And I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but
Yeah, so we have helped many municipalities with the disposition of municipal land for affordable housing. And many of those sites are, if the development is to be affordable, then the site is oftentimes donated, or it's very low cost to help make it more financially feasible. And then that's part of the local contribution to the development.
Right.
Developer can take that to the state to get additional resources. When you write a request for proposals, RFP, so you just need to be careful with procurement laws around how directive it is, because if the community is too directive about what the development looks like and how it will be built out, then it can then end up can be seen as a municipal project, which means then the project would be more expensive, because all of the procurement laws would come into place with wages, et cetera. So there is a lot of guidance around, provide a lot of guidance around how a community writes an RFP with it not becoming a municipal project, if that makes sense. So
Is that like the town of West Newbury has, like Lee was saying, the town of West Newbury has land that we would like to sell or to, say, Habitat for Humanity. Are we in trouble if we write an RFP that is so restrictive that the only applicant is going to be Habitat for Humanity? Is that what you're saying?
there could be, so I'm not an expert. I'm just, when I heard things like how it will look, what it will look like, when you get really specific like that, then it can cross a line into being a municipal project. And that, you just don't want to, you want to make sure that when you do get to that point, that you are consulting someone who has expertise, just so that you're following all of kind of procurement guidelines for the municipality. So I don't want to say exactly, because I don't know exactly how you're working it, but when I heard the design, what it will look like, then that can oftentimes get sticky.
Right. I say that because I think our town has a very significant NIMBY problem. But if a community could do, if we as a community could develop something that is that looks like our town, I think that would be more welcomed by neighbors and passersby, etc.
Yeah, there's definitely ways that you can add language to relay your values without being overly prescriptive in the RFP.
Right. Okay. That's very good advice. Thank you. Not to be overly prescriptive. I have experience trying to prescribe to developers what we would like to have something be or look like a house or whatever. And they were completely ignored by the developer anyway. So even though it was all in writing and signed off, but anyway, that's not your problem.
I have a question in terms of making public land available for affordable housing. Is that a step that needs to happen, before the trust is actually looking at projects and putting out an RFP? Or does it happen like in concert? Because I know, or I believe that town meeting has to vote to release public lands for something like that.
So it doesn't have to happen before an affordable housing trust is established. The trust could be engaged in that process. It could be one of the kind of the projects that the trust focuses on. And we do have communities like Wellfleet as an example, where their trust is one of the key things that they're looking at is to help look for sites, municipal and private, that could potentially be used for affordable housing. So to help to facilitate that. So it doesn't have to, that doesn't have to be done before. It could be something that the trust actually helps support, frankly, support you in and the planning board to do.
Are you familiar with any public-private partnerships to create, say, a multi-unit rental entity, and where some of that rent could then feed back, if there's any profit from that, where some of that rent could feed back into the trust?
So the challenge is that when we're talking about affordable housing, that there isn't profit from that because the rents are suppressed. So we do have a trust on the Cape that decided years ago to buy houses to then rent as affordable housing. And what they quickly found was that there's never enough for capital costs and for longer term costs with the homes. And when it's because the rents hardly cover just the basics. And so they had that kind of idea that it would help fuel the trust. But what they ended up doing is, actually, I'm not sure if they've been able to do it yet, but they were looking for a nonprofit to actually take on all of them, because a nonprofit that has experience in affordable housing can better pool together scattered site developments and then refinance them together. And it's through the refinancing and taking out cash against them that then they have the cost for capital improvements. But for it's just not realistic on a small scale for a volunteer board to do that, and there just is not profit. It always takes subsidy. So
if a development of if an affordable housing development can never be profitable, then how can a developer be enticed to create it? I'm thinking rental property.
because part of the financing they're allowed, because they have to make a profit, to put in a profit. And so that's financed through all the financing sources in the subsidy. But it's not like there's, so it's enough to keep their engines running for them to do another project. But for the trust to have small scale, oftentimes it's scattered sites or a small development, to the cost of maintaining it, of the capital costs, you likely need to have a consultant or someone else doing that. Like the numbers just don't work out to then have money to fuel the trust. It's not structured.
I understand.
It's
That's why I
important.
measure, I mean, you wouldn't want to try to put the maintenance of rental property on the trust or any other piece of town government. That's why I was talking about a public-private partnership. There would be a developer who would maintain it, et cetera, do all the administrative work, and then have a share of profits go back to the town. But I understand.
Well, so the public-private partnership is that the trusts help developers do that. And then it's through their financing and their portfolio that they're able to manage it, where the trust isn't doing it. So we have a community, so Somerville, I mean, a very different community than West Newbury, but they are putting local funds into a nonprofit to buy triple deckers, so 3-family houses that are scattered around the city. So they're trying to preserve these, and then they're putting restrictions on it so that they're affordable housing. But the nonprofit is able to have, they call it 100 homes, because they're trying to preserve 100 units, of at least 100 units. So it becomes more financially feasible when a nonprofit who has the expertise can have a portfolio of a lot of different units, that then they finance them together and they manage them together. So it's completely plausible. It's what we suggest, is that a trust help invest in a nonprofit developer or a for-profit developer to do that kind of work in the community, not expecting the trust to actually do it.
Right. I wouldn't want to put that on the trust. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are different nonprofit developers that you could, if you do decide to put out a request for proposals on a municipal site for affordable housing, you can make sure that different nonprofit developers receive the RFP, as well as for-profit developers, and the trust can then help to support a development like that with additional funds and work collaboratively that way.
And like Lee was saying, where the town does own some property, can that, I assume from your presentation, the town could transfer that property to the trust, and then the trust could then deal with that property, dispose of that property, transfer ownership of the property as appropriate.
So the trust could. So some communities have decided to do it that way. Other communities, it stays the town, maybe it's the select board, or it's the ownership is not transferred to the trust. So it depends on your community whether you want to transfer to the trust, or whether the trust is just engaged in the process, supports the process.
Gotcha.
So we see it both ways.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Ray, if I could just follow up on your comment. The intriguing thing to me about the community land trust is that the town of West Newbury could put the land into this community land trust and own the land and have whatever mechanism we decide on, build homes that are affordable, and the homes get sold to people who qualify for affordable housing. But the community land trust has a ground lease on that land. And so West Newbury in its form still continues to own the land. The affordable housing people purchase the home, and then there are all kinds of restrictions on the home, and they get, there's all kinds of formulas like that. But I thought that might be an interesting thing for us to look into as well, because we do have land that the town currently owns that we could work that way. It's not exactly the same as Shelley, as you were saying, the Affordable Housing Trust, but it's just another way for us to solve this problem.
Yeah, a land trust is going to be a a much bigger undertaking than an affordable housing trust. So it's because affordable housing trust is relying on people who already have the expertise, developers that are already building to do it generally. And a land trust it's building a lot more capacity and a structure. And so it's different, but it's I think a fascinating model as well.
We could do both. Is there any reason why we couldn't do both?
If you felt like you had the capacity and the bandwidth to do both, you could explore both.
Okay. So warned.
Any other questions for Shelley? This has been an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been very revealing. You know, a lot of times folks do have the impression that what we're talking about when we say affordable housing, it's strictly the 40B. And it's been revealing with all the different examples that you gave, Shelley, that, you know, there's a lot of flexibility out there, and, you know, it's all has to be for the public good, but there are very many different models, and including some followed by small communities, you know, like ours. So this has been very helpful. So I appreciate, you know, the fact that you made yourself available for additional questions, and, you know, I'm sure on an ongoing basis we'll be calling upon you there. And if you could share the presentation, I think you said you gave Leah the PDF. Perfect. Okay. But thanks again. And I think that's it for this presentation, but I just wanted to express our appreciation for all your time this evening.
Absolutely. And I'll be in touch with Leah, and thank you so much. It was really nice to be with you tonight.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
You too. Bye-bye.